Listen to them.
The curators of the night.
What sweet
Cubes.
thematic.
Welcome to UberCube, the podcast we discuss all things cube, but with refreshments. This is your host, Anthony Adams, aka UberBear, and today I'm joined by my host,
Stu. And unfortunately, much to the detriment of the show, and I'm sure everyone's chagrin, our superior host, May, is sitting this one out. She's feeling a little under the weather, but we are very excited to be joined by a wonderful guest on this episode, and the victor of, I'm just going to say the greatest cube event in the history of the world.
of this part of the world.
Oh, all right, fine.
How about you introduce yourself there?
Hey everybody, I'm Tyler Cruz, champion of the UberCube, and I go by the tag Tyrowo.
In case anybody's wondering what UberCubeathon was, that was way back in April. And because of summertime and family planning and vacations, and you were jaunting about the world anyways, weren't you? You were just traveling
Always.
about.
Yeah, no doubt.
We're finally able to fulfill our promise that we would bring the champion, the victor of UberCubeathon Part 1. We're going to do the Electric Boogaloo. That's what we're talking about.
Part 2, baby.
We're going to try to run it back next April. You
You
coming
know
out
it.
to defend that title?
Oh, you know it.
All right, we're going to make you wear a crown, and we're going to tell everybody about it. We're going to just point at you a lot.
Crown, robe, stave,
We'll announce you.
proper costume.
You're going to have to pick your music when you enter into it. We're going to say, welcome.
Oh, yeah.
That sounds sick. I was talking to my play group. They were like already down for it. They had
All
a
right.
great time at the event, just watching me play all day.
Yeah, we'll get you hooked up. I'm gonna start having communications with the LGS again, probably in January. We're gonna try to run it back in April.
It was wildly successful, not just for us and the people that played there who all gave great feedback, but the store seemed to do pretty good out of it. The drinks were flowing and, the products were flying off the shelves. So I think it was a good time, and yeah, we can't wait to roll it back again.
I want to this isn't what the episode's about, but I kind of want to revisit that for a second before we get into our beer cracking and all the things we're going to do. But it was you versus our good friend Lincoln. And I sat there and you guys were under duress. Like there was some really bad karaoke of Danny Boy going on. What was that like?
Yeah, it was
No
bad.
lights.
Oh, it was actually kind of bringing me in my element. I work with the lights off because I'm staring at screens all day. And then I do a lot of karaoke in my free time. So I was vibing, actually. I felt in my element.
That's almost like an
Luckily,
unfair advantage,
So go for it.
Lincoln was using initiative and you were using womp parallax wave. I remember watching that and I was thinking, oh no, here we go. And I watched you just start doing some pretty cool, some pretty dope parallax wave movements.
It was, and I'll say it showed the strength of your deck because I had kind of followed Lincoln around a little bit and observed some of his games, and he was wrecking people like through that draft and through the games that he was playing. I'm like, man, I don't know how anyone's going to beat you with this deck, but parallax wave just against any creature-centric kind of deck just does a lot of work, and that was a big difference maker.
It was great, though. It was really great having you out, and we're really looking forward to having you come back. And like I
Yes.
said, we're going to do a
Again.
big announcement, make a big deal out of it. So we actually wanted to honor you here a little bit and do something kind of sweet. We're going to enjoy a little bit of horror tropes topic here a little bit because we are in the spooky season.
We are.
Yeah, but before we go any further down this rabbit hole of nonsense, we're going to enjoy our libations of the show. And let's start out with our esteemed guest/champion, victor of UberCubeathon Part 1.
Well, I hate to disappoint. I know you told me to bring a refreshment, but I am heavy cutting trying to go into this wedding. So I brought the classic refreshment, water.
Excellent. Can't beat it.
And
Hydrate, baby.
I am having me a nice little wicked weed perny here. How
Nice.
about yourself?
I have got, this is the Stone Gargoyle, frighteningly fresh, and it's from Stone Brewing. And I think this might be a first for me, and it's quite strong, so I'm going to be sipping on this one throughout the episode.
All right, let's crack them open and kind of get to a little pre-lum we're going to do here.
All right, so horror Movies. Let's start with the movies. And again, let's start with our esteemed colleague or our esteemed guest over there. What is your favorite horror movie?
Well, you think about horror and you can't have less than 2 favorite horror movies. At least I can't, because back when I was in high school, I had this big friend group and we tried our best. Back when Blockbuster was still alive, we would go out, try and find the worst horror movie we could find out in the stores. And so you got to have your best horror movie and your worst horror movie, right? So, worst horror movie, I don't know if you guys have ever heard of it, but it is The Ginger Dead Man.
Yes. Yes,
great.
I have. I am ginger.
Yeah, classic. Murderer falls into a vat of dough, becomes an undead gingerbread man. The title explains itself. It's a mess. It's really, truly bad. But as far as really good horror movies, there was a movie that came out in 2007. I was getting into foreign horror movies a lot because Rec had come out back then. And I was like, oh, Spanish horror films are pretty good. And so I watched this really great horror movie called The Orphanage, La Orfanada, I think. And it is your traditional ghost paranormal horror movie. It doesn't have a lot of cheap scares, really kind of messes with you without doing anything too cheap. Liked it a lot. You guys should check it out.
All right.
Okay.
I'm sold.
Okay. And so I kind of told them I only had one, but what they didn't realize underneath my one, there's actually a couple of them. But we're going to start out with the one that I think is my personal favorite. And it is actually In the Mouth of Madness. And it came out in 1994. And it was by our good friend, John Carpenter, who also did The Thing and The Prince of Darkness, which are also definitely on my S tier levels if you guys haven't seen these films. But In the Mouth of Madness, what I loved about it so much is it's like a psychological horror, cosmic horror. It's very Lovecraftian inspired, and it is just crazy. Sam Neill's performance it's just unsettling. If you haven't seen it, it didn't really do well with the critics, but it's one of those films that it's kind of like Office Space. When it first came out, nobody actually went to go see Office Space in the theater, but once it came out, it was out. And then people realized. It's kind of like, what's another one that's kind of fall into that genre too? It's the other Sam Neill space movie with Lawrence Fishburne.
I can picture the hazy blue
Event Horizon.
Event Horizon.
There we go. I knew we'd get there together. I didn't want to Google that one. But it kind of is like Event Horizon, but now we're going into a hotel where everything's mutated and deformed in this village. And Mouth of Madness, though, is just definitely one of my best.
Very cool. And I love, part of the Apocalypse trilogy. I noticed that you've got that in the notes as well. And The Thing, I don't know if I would say it's my favorite, but it's definitely S tier, maybe even top 5, maybe even top 3 for me would be The Thing. Like an absolute classic. Kurt Russell, John Carpenter, just magnificent movie, an absolute must watch. But I'm going to have to go with something a little more traditional, and Anthony knows, and I've talked about it on the show before, Alien, the original, the best in the franchise. For me, it's just without equal as far as horror is concerned. Just that one single alien on that ship it blew my mind when I first watched it. It was released in the same year that I was born. And I'm also going to give a shout out to the Evil Dead movies as well. Like that's the more on the horror comedy kind of scale of things. But I love Sam Raimi and Bruce Campbell, and so they had a special term. It was like a requel or something that they called the Evil Dead 2, because it's meant to be, it's not a prequel, it's not a sequel, it's almost like a retelling. That's why they call it like a requel.
The young lady that starts the first film, if I'm not mistaken, was a brunette, but when they retell the story, she's a blonde. Literally recanting the same story from part 2 to part 1. It was fantastic. They changed characters, everything.
And just takes
it's so bad.
Yeah, and it just takes so much from so many other horror movies. And I've been watching a lot recently. I decided to go back, this is just in the last few weeks, and go through all the early 80s New Line cinema, some really obscure old horror movies think Monsters from the Deep and Galaxy of Terror and stuff like that. And they're all just the special effects are outrageous and the acting is B-movie-esque, but just everything, the stories and the covers and everything are just, they're magnificent.
Now, if your brain's on fire right now and you're saying, that's not my gothic horror, that's not my, I don't think sci-fi horror qualifies, I don't think cosmic horror qualifies, because that's not my type of horror. I'm a Bram Stoker, I'm a Mary Shelley type of person. Well, that's kind of the point of this episode, and we're going to apply this to a cube. And what we're going to specifically talk about is kind of revisiting an older idea. We have talked about this before, but this is about how thematic construction of a cube, and in this case, we're going to be really focused on Uberbear's horror cube, mine. But what we're going to talk about is how the confines of Innistrad, and how even though I went Innistrad Plus, I still allowed my rules to overtake me to not improve the cube at a detriment. You tracking what I'm saying here?
I do, yeah. And I think that's a nice sort of consistent theme that you've looked to stick with when it comes to the cube design, right? Because it's so easy to get all carried away with all the fancy new cards and all the, fancy new mechanics and, oh, look, that card might do a little bit more for a little bit less. And I think when you've got a cube like that you've set out with a purpose for, right? You want that theme, you want that vibe, and you want to stick with it. And I think that, you've got it right here in the show notes. It is a heavy restriction on yourself as a curator to say, I am going to ignore the existence for however many cards that could, for many good reasons, fit in this cube because thematically or whatever decks, building deck construction options I might provide. But from a thematic perspective, I want to keep it this way. It's admirable. I'll say that.
So Tyler, I'm going to pose you a question, and I'm going to kind of say this is it'll be a reflection upon all of us. But what if restriction, while it breeds creativity, also stymies creativity? Question mark.
Yeah, it's a critical push and pull, because I see the same thing with people trying to play EDH decks where you're trying to find the balance between going with a theme and what feels fun to play as a player. And at the end of the day, for me as a Magic player, I think play experience is crucial. And I definitely think trying to strong arm a theme leaves you with a bunch of dead cards that kind of just make everybody look at it and be like, all right, well, who even wants that, So it can be tough.
We've talked about that before, and it's kind of a side note, but an example of that in that environment would be like lords. And that could be any kind of lord, right? I don't care if it's like the Goblin King, right? Ultimately, that lord, if you oversaturate that, you kind of inhibit the ability for diversified decks, is what I'm trying to say in so many words.
Yeah, I think with the existence of lords, and I think that, there's a lot of them in your cube, right? In this horror cube, there's a fair number of lords. And what they will tend to do is push players unwillingly or willingly towards a very aggressive play style and just taking cards that fit the theme of that lord. And they absolutely can be secondary, like, hey, I'm going to draft a deck that has some kind of combo-y or control-y or synergistic way of being played out, but I'm just going to slap this lord in there because why not have a card in there that just boosts all the other creatures that I've got and gives them an extra power and toughness? Or from a deck building and then a psychological perspective, it could also be, oh man, all my creatures are bigger, I can just turn them sideways.
Right, and it's tough because you do have some really cool creature themes, like having white have a lot of spirits, and so you have blue-white, your lords in a different color. That's kind of sweet. You've got werewolf lords. Lots of zombies lords are kind of linear, but then you get kind of a blue-black. It can be a little one-dimensional to an extent, but at the same time, at least you have like themed aggro, and you're not just like, oh, I'm going to play the best one-drops that I can find,
Yeah, and I love that you actually specified the spirits, because when we first really started getting heavily into drafting this cube, this was a few years ago now, probably 3 or 4 years ago.
Stu has never told this story on the show.
I haven't. I drafted a spirits deck, and I've mentioned this before, but I drafted a spirits deck. I knew that individually they were powerful, but I also knew as a collective with the lords and with the combination of just, here, do this if you've got a spirit, or bump this or do that, I knew that the spirits deck would be very powerful, and I drafted Azoria spirits, and I think I lost one game out of 6 or 9 matches that I played, but it just wiped the table. It was winning on turn 4, maybe turn 5, incredibly consistently. And like you say, it's an aggro deck. And it wasn't necessarily just turned into an aggro deck because I had that Lords there, but oh my gosh, did it make it quicker to finish the games out.
So curation is a very personal relationship. It's kind of like an artist painting on an easel at that point, right? You as the curator, the owner of the cube, are very select in choice of what cards you want to go into your cube. And this is my personal relationship. As I build new cubes, I want to challenge myself more. And I place restrictions on myself with intent. It also gives novelty to my designs. It makes them unique. It makes them stand out. If I were just going to do Innistrad set cube, I would like that, but I wanted to have Innistrad Plus so that I could bring my own flavor, my own touch to the idea of Innistrad. And then I want to give this kind of as a broad stroke for people listening. We're not going to just talk about horror cubes, even though it is very much a sub-theme. But like an example for someone listening is if your cube is art restricted or plane restricted or creature type restricted or rarity restricted. So what is your personal relationship, your choice, your decision as to why you're making that? And then ask yourself, am I doing this? I guess, is it self-serving or is it for your players? You did say that. It's like putting down the hammer. And then my second follow-up question to the listeners and to you guys, purist to a theme, is it always a good thing? Question mark.
So I haven't practiced doing any themed cubes yet. I pretty much just work on my vintage cube. But it reminds me of trying to put together a Toxrill deck that I was working on for EDH for my fiance who has an affinity for slugs. And so I looked at it and I was like, all right, I want to put together like a slug deck. And you look at it and there's literally just not enough cards for slugs. I was like, okay, well, Toxrill's a horror. So just like the cube, I tried to put together like a horror deck. And you get to a point where like, sure, there's technically enough cards to fill that theme out, but how much quality are you sacrificing where you're looking at some of these and you're just like, this is not it, you know?
Yeah, so card quality does play a role in this conversation too. You have to decide, are you sticking to the bit or is it card quality for the betterment of the cube? That's ultimately what we're piecemealing here. It's what we're taking out of this conversation. An example, this was eye-opening for me. So there was one point where I'm supporting a lot of werewolves, whether it's the Day and Night or the OG werewolves from Innistrad, etc. And my play group had this strong distaste for the idea of werewolves. These cards, you can't make these good. I don't love them. I don't like that style of play. I do have players in my group that are fascinated by the idea, and I know they're weak. So instead of stepping back, I look at this as challenge accepted. I'm going to dive deeper down the rabbit hole with the werewolves.
Down the wolf hole?
Down the wolf hole, yes. And I'm going to push this even harder than I should. So I've intentionally oversaturated them. But then we go to CubeCon this next round, 2024, and we go up for everybody's looking at our cubes, trying to make a decision, and there were 3 Innistrad type cubes that were in the running versus the other cubes. I believe there were 6 in the poll. Uberbear's Horror Cube was featured at CubeCon 2023. So I put it up again because I've made some slight improvements to it, but then I get kind of the feedback, and I see this in the Discord. I'm just not dealing with these modal double-faced cards again. I just don't want to deal with this. And I understand that. Like a lot of people said, I don't want to deal with werewolves. And I remember specifically at CubeCon 2023, our good friend Bones told us there was a judging incident where you've got old and new werewolves and this mixture and interactions. And it really brings about a point of contention or complexity that really doesn't need to exist. And as I listen to more and more podcasts and groups, people just don't like the idea of flipping over cards, let alone werewolves. And why am I so dug in supporting this is the question I asked myself.
Why are you?
Well,
I'm not anymore.
It's that
I'm
shoehorn
glad you
keep
came
talking.
to that.
Get in there.
It's funny though, because like the werewolf fans, in a word, are rabid for it. Like I've got a friend who I used to cube with all the time. Any chance he could get to stick a werewolf card into his deck, even to his detriment, he was gonna do it. And I saw that with your cube a little bit. I was like, there's like a really awkward play pattern for werewolves too, where all of their cards come out at turn 4. So you want to be an aggro deck, but you're stuck in this mid-range kind of period. And it's just frustrating. All of it, it just doesn't ever come together.
So it made me step back and rethink. And specifically, the catalyst for this is Duskmourn. Duskmourn has offered a new suite of tools and quite a bit for the green section. And we're going to talk about this more, like Manifest Red. And even Red got some goodies that allowed me to kind of step back and go, well, before, in the previous iteration, I was supporting things like Delirium, but it felt very forced. Like, it felt like I was trying really hard to get stuff in the graveyard via self-mill, and the payoffs just weren't there. I mean, we had our spider spawnings and things like this, right? And I had my lab mans and all that, but there's really no reason to play that deck unless you were in that lane or you're going some form of reanimator. But Duskmourn has opened up a whole new lane, and because the green cards and the red cards are so enticing, I finally said, well, maybe the gothic horror genre that I've been clinging on to so hard, I've been just heels dug in, even adding more, just I'll teach you guys not to like my cube, that it kind of made me say, hey, I don't even like playing these things that much. I really don't enjoy it. Stu and I talked about that recently. Aggro is my least favorite style of play. Stu, would you agree? Any form of it. Just turning sideways, it's not my personal way of playing Magic.
And it's 2024, and this is maybe a little bit off topic, but this is a bugaboo that I think I've found myself facing, is that so many creature cards nowadays, the obviously powerful abilities that creature cards have nowadays, pretty well established, right? All the way down to CMC 1 creatures, CMC 2, all the way up, right? Very, very powerful. But also that there doesn't seem to be much of a sacrifice for power and toughness anymore that used to exist with cards that had a very relevant ability tacked onto them, right? So one of the cards that I brought up, and it's not relevant specifically to this cube, was something like Moldrifter, where you're paying 5 mana, you're getting a 2/2 flyer, and you're getting to draw a couple of cards, but you're only getting a 2/2 flyer for that 5 mana, and the value is in the cards. And we were looking at one, and I don't recall the name, we can maybe post it in the show notes or on the Discord after the fact, but it was a flyer, you draw 2, but you do have to discard 1. Oh my gosh, I'm so devastated, because you always hate putting cards in the graveyard, right? And it triggers ETB, and it triggers on attack, right? But it's not a 2/2, it's not a 3/2, it's not a 4/2, it's a 5/3. So there's no real downside to a card like that from an aggressive perspective, right? So now we're looking at the perspective that, is everything aggro? And I know, again, that this is me getting off topic and kind of ranting a little bit.
He's referring to the Overlord of the Flood Pits.
Overlord of the Flood Pits, that's the name of the card, yeah. But it's like, that's an aggro card. So now, and really looking at a cube like this, when you're trying to put those kind of themes in, where they're not aggro themes, how much of a challenge do you face as a curator to think, okay, I want to be able to put cards in that support these archetypes and maybe even these creature types, but I don't just want every card to be an aggressive card.
And real quick, Tyler, just so you know, hi, this is Stu. He thinks everything is aggro.
Everything is aggro.
All right, Tyler.
Everything is kind of aggro if you turn it sideways. But I bemoan the same things, you know. It's like my personal vendetta against Wizards right now is that everything has to have a commander-oriented kind of deal for every set. And so you take cards like Merfolk Looter and you're like, okay, let's make it a legendary creature and give it prowess and also give it an activated ability that like lets you play more spells, like, and that's a legendary in Bloomburrow now. And it can be a little frustrating because it's like the creatures are just, I mean, you get more and more pushed every chance you get.
Well, you bring a good point when you say something like that. You're talking about like Merfolk Looter or any iteration of that would be excellent for this cube, right? I'm trying to do self-mill. I'm trying to bend things. I'm trying to put it in. But it doesn't have a gothic horror or a scary image associated with it. I mean, you could kind of say borderline Lovecraftian with the Merfolk type idea if you really wanted to push it. But it seems like a real stretch of the idea.
I'd be pretty scared if I walked in my backyard and saw a Merfolk. So it might.
But you see where I'm going? Like a card like that would be highly beneficial to a cube that's trying to do what I'm trying to do. But I'm clinching onto this theme of gothic horror at the time, right? Werewolves, vampire spirits, you get the idea, right? Versus humans. Innistrad. I'm locked in this Innistrad plus type of environment. And while Merfolk Looter is not a good example, and Bloomburrow certainly with a cute little otter isn't going to make the cut because the aesthetics aren't there. But you can see where mechanically a card like that would actually benefit an environment trying to accomplish the goals that I'm trying to accomplish outside of the artistic aesthetic. Do you see the
Well, otters
conundrum
can
that
be
I deal
pretty
with?
scary.
Yeah, otters can
If
be
you
very
watch
scary.
some otter videos, but yeah, you're right. You can't stick a cute little otter in this cube. It just doesn't work thematically.
Yeah.
And it's funny, you were talking about something earlier when you were talking about Tox roll on the commander side, and you mentioned something that's actually in my notes to a degree. There was a point I pondered for the longest time. I'm currently at 360 with this, and I held this tight-knit envelope because mostly at the concern or the detriment of self-mill. If I got too wide in the cube size, things like self-mill would suffer, right? It would struggle to exist. I'd have to saturate it more than I currently am. So I keep 360 for the tightness. But over and over again after playing this cube with our friends, hanging out, every time I've thought about, like, I did not enjoy turning that sideways and kind of playing the same old linear path. Why don't I go to 450 and why don't I put nightmares and horrors in this cube? That way I can still have a factional kindred aspect about the cube. But when I reviewed them, I felt like you did with the slugs. I'm like, these just aren't that good at the time. Like they're just kind of putting bad cards in there to put them in to expand the breadth of the cube. And they still ultimately just turn sideways anyways. That was the problem that I kept experiencing. Can you guys follow that flow?
Yep.
So back to the original question. Does keeping this cube so tight-knit, does it stymie the creativity and the versatility of the cube? I think you both are answering affirmative on that.
Yes.
Right.
Because any restriction is going to be something that's going to prevent you putting in a card. Like you just literally said, I want to put that card in, but I can't because it doesn't fit the theme. So that statement by itself should tell you that, yes, that restriction that you've placed on yourself is going to be restrictive from a card selection perspective. Now, going back again, Tyler, what you said, right? You've got this vibe, you've got this theme, you've got this environment that you want to curate, that you want to create for your players. So yes, it doesn't fit the theme if you've got an otter or something of the ilk in this HP Lovecraftian horror themed cube. But that's the poison of the chalice, right? That you're going to have to now work within those restrictions that you've imposed upon yourself.
I think the key is kind of slanting the restrictions. Like you try your hardest to get to the theme, but if it's like adjacent, as long as it's not like super cute, maybe it has a home there. Like one of the examples that I wanted to bring up was I was staring in the blue pile at Armored Scab. Like nobody wants to play a 3-drop that mills you for 4 and then that's it. It's done. It's doing all it's done for your self-mill deck. And I was thinking about how Hedron Crab would be a strict upgrade for the self-mill strategy. But crabs don't they don't scare you, but they are like a little monstery to an extent. I think sometimes when it's like such an important improvement for the theme of the deck that you're trying to sculpt in the cube, that maybe you have to make that sacrifice like in a handful of spots, you know?
And a little bit to give you the background on that decision, though. Initially, when I built this cube, I did have cards because Innistrad did support it. They supported Mill, and Mill, in my opinion, was oversaturated, and it made for some very unfun games in this environment. And it didn't create that tension, that challenge that self-mill does. Self-mill is uncomfortable. It's unsettling. Like, you got to be really tactical. You got to pay attention to what you're doing, right? You're deck checking. They're deck checking you. But when I was just milling them out, there was like a shriek or something. It was a spirit bird or whatever it was in the first one. And I had that in there, and I could just keep striking you and just make you mill your deck. And I would just cut your aggro deck to pieces. You didn't even really stand a chance because you weren't tooled for that. And maybe I was even capitalizing off that. I saw that where at the time, I am reanimating your cards and bringing them back to my side of the table. So I'm doing this with intent. And I did try that out. And we talked about it, my good buddy Samich and I, Chris, he's my cube coach. We just decided ultimately, let's just let mill anything that has the possibility to be redirected. I think there's one scab in there that does do it. But outside of that, I want to take everything that has the option of me milling you. It's not a line of play that made this environment fun. I did try it. It was kind of miserable. So Hedron Crab, great, but it would be used for malicious purposes. And I want to be able you would never say, I'm just going to self-mill myself to get my lab man. Maybe you did. You're good. But 95% of the time, you know exactly what Hedron Crab would be doing.
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes sense.
That is the challenge on the side table. It's the mechanical aspects. Yes, it's a crab. They did actually just reprint one, if I'm not mistaken. I don't know the name of the card. It has a skull face on it. It's like a spider crab thing from Duskmourn, which kind of leads me into Duskmourn. So Duskmourn did a fantastic job of kind of waking this up for me to get me outside of that vampires, werewolves, zombies, human spirits kind of motion that I was constantly doing. We talked about that. I think Duskmourn was very refreshing. Outside of the humans, I did not personally, the human art I could do with or without. Like, it was straight out of Scooby-Doo. The rest of it was just horrifying, and then you had Scooby-Doo characters. But aside from that, they introduced stuff like toys, and they enhanced Delirium to a degree. They made it viable because mechanically, Stu and I were pre-gaming, and my original iteration or current iteration as of last night, Delirium wasn't really even that good. You kind of got it accidentally through self-mill. Now you can get it with intent, more payoffs. I mean, Duskmourn just absolutely brought more of that horror genre and brought in the nightmares and horrors and toys and weird, creepy vibes. Any thoughts about that from either one of you?
I will say this. I love keywords like Delirium that they're not bonkers powerful. They're powerful, but they reward you for both just playing magic, right? Because getting stuff into your graveyard is part of sort of an inevitability of playing magic, right? If you attack with creatures, they're going to put in the graveyard. If you crack a fetch or play an instant or a sorcery, things are going to end up in the graveyard. But it's also a type that you can build around as well, where, okay, I am trying to self-mill or I am trying to get stuff in the graveyard. So things like Delirium are great because they're just more really fun options for the players. And especially with like red, we'll talk about a couple of the colors, right? Red specifically. Red is an aggressive color. So now you've got other options with a color that typically, okay, I'm just going to draft red. I'm going to turn my hasty creatures, prowess creatures sideways and burn you out. Now you've got other options for ways that you can build colors. And I think that's, for me especially, that's so important to have choices like that. And I think for the fun factor of the cube in general.
So I want to go back to what you said earlier about the cute little otter, which would be the perfect card for this horror cube if it was anything else but an otter, right?
A zombie otter.
A zombie otter would almost cut it, but still be a little too cute. I need a dead otter. But Clockwork Percussionist, for 1 red, you get an artifact creature, monkey toy. Let's just pause right there. Artifact creature, it's a monkey, and it's a toy. None of those have anything to do outside of maybe I'm going to let toy come into this. None of that meets my qualifiers. But the art is just absolutely uncomfortable. It's disturbing. And there's actually 2 arts. Tyler, pull up the other art while we're sitting here talking about this. There's 2 arts of it on Scryfall. And I encourage the listeners to do this as well. There's one where it's the monkey that's, if you walk past this thing, you're not going to feel great about what's happening. But then there's another art that has, it basically explaining what is happening behind it.
It's subtle.
It's
Let's
very
say that.
subtle.
It's
You
subtle.
have to flicker between the 2 arts. And I need to pick this one up. But it's an uncomfortable card. It's not something it's something about it is just, it gives a vibe. Because part of my cube idea here is to, while we're playing it, we generally play it either with the lights dimmed down. We play music that's kind of matching the genre. We play this every Halloween. So it's important to me that you're also feeling those horror movie, In the Mouth of Madness, or you're feeling Aliens if that's where you're at. But I want that vibe to not be overtaken by putting in cards that detract from not just the gameplay, but the feeling that Innistrad and these horror tropes all bring upon you while you're playing Magic.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting one because the vampires and the werewolves and the zombies are all very in your face. Right? That is just the stuff of nightmares and old horror movies and, there's a vampire after me or there's a werewolf chasing me or something like that. This is, I think, a little more subtle, even though, yes, you could certainly say the artwork is pretty bananas, but I feel like it's just a little less in your face. And I think that's great that you're sort of making these choices to, shift away from that very, very prototypical Lovecraftian, again, horror with those kind of tropes and putting in cards like this that can just fit the theme of the cube so nicely.
And people are desensitized from these traditional monster, the monster universe that we've always dealt with, right? I mean, vampires are great and they're unsettling, but there's a point now where Hollywood is they're overproduced, not just Hollywood, but across the entire globe. Vampires are just all the way from Nosferatu to current, right?
We've gone from Nosferatu to Edward.
And now we're going back to Nosferatu again, by the way. It's coming out again. But it's Fright Night. It's all kind of played out. And then something about a monkey beating on this demon drum. It's just very uncomfortable. And that is part of what I want you to feel. Back when you mentioned the otter, it would be mechanically extremely strong. The one from Bloomborough, there's too many sets. But it would just, it's something about when you're curating these, I have to make these choices. And this card's just fantastic. It's haste. Whenever Clockwork Percussionist dies, exile the top card of your library. You may play it until the end of your next turn. I mean, it's just great. And it encourages things like it goes into the aristocrats. It goes into the self-sacrifice. It's just neat. But it's also, I don't support artifacts. But because it's an artifact creature, it now goes into delirium. So it finds its own little new home by turning stuff on. And that's just something I have to think about. So I wanted your guys' thoughts on that card.
I like it.
I think it's nice.
Yeah. I couldn't find the alt art. I could only find the one with the like big tongue sticking out of the drum. Is that what you're talking about?
It's exactly the same, but you must flicker through the two of them. So you brought the challenge upon the listeners. Don't spoil it for them. Go back and forth on Scryfall and then look at the two images and look in the top right-hand corner and see what happens.
Yeah, you've almost got to either like have an image zoom hover that you can like sort of go back and forth if you're looking at it on Scryfall, or even just open the two versions in two different tabs and sort of flick between them. I think once you sort of have them side by side and you quickly go back and forth, it'll become a little bit more obvious. But it is pretty subtle. It's a cool change.
Yeah, listeners, if you hadn't noticed this, check out Clockwork Percussionist on your own, but it is awesome. We'll let Tyler get to that. But the next one is... you still don't see it. We'll tell you after the show.
Yeah, we'll tell you after the show.
We don't want to spoil it. We don't want to spoil it. It's very subtle. But the fear of missing out is another card that I added.
This is much more in-your-face, frightening. Like, this is very disturbing. This is almost like the end monster of the 80s crazy horror movie that someone really, really put a lot of time and a big budget on the special effects. Like this, the art is crazy. There's something coming out of whatever the heck that is and all the limbs that it has, and it's kind of got a dress on. Yeah, very much more in your face. I love the art.
And it's a nightmare, and it's unsettling.
It is a nightmare.
And it has delirium, and it wasn't hard for me. This one's actually the last one that I did add, but it wasn't difficult for me to... This is an enchantment creature, again, outside of what I've been doing mechanically, but, it's better than a lot of vampires. It's better than some burn spells that I had. It just does more dynamic things, but still follows my... I guess the baseline of what my cube's trying to do, but my horizons have been broadened. Again, I want to go back to I was very much Bram Stoker. I was very much Mary Shelley, right? And now I can kind of be okay with going a little bit outside of those boundaries. And I did self-proclaim that didn't even want to be Innistrad. For me, Innistrad's really cool. But every iteration of this cube, I've actually made it Innistrad Plus, where I've been running some high-value spells in there, right? I've been running, originally I had Demonic Tutor and stuff, which I've cut all these things, but I did have Vampiric Tutor. I wanted this to be the most pushed version of Innistrad. The side effect of that was those cards always got picked. The monkey never got picked in my story if it existed. Downplaying that backwards, though, I still maintain these very interactive, strong magic level, not just it's not a set. It's a set plus. Now I get to go a little further and break outside of it. It's a mold breaking type of scenario for me. Any thoughts on that?
Keep breaking the mold. If I get to play with Fear of Missing Out and Clockwork Percussionist because you've chosen to expand the horizons of the cube and the limitations of the cube, then I'm about it.
Yeah, I think there were some big winners in this set. Thematically and mechanically, they really went in some cool directions. And breaking out of gothic horror to more mainstream horror themes could be, as long as you don't look at it like it's diluting what your cube is trying to do, I think it could be a really cool direction. Like on the subject of that monkey, I think another big winner for the set was the doll based on Annabelle.
Yeah.
She is a killer. And that is okay, I found this banger little uncommon in my opening pack. Now I have a reason to want to draft all these little 1 and 2 drop red and white cards. And it's going to feel great. And also be based on one of the most popular horror series of this modern era, which I mean, I liked a couple of them, but
It goes into the Conjuring
sweet.
universe. It was really great. I loved everything about that.
Yeah.
Did you ever read the story of the husband and wife that went around doing that? I can't remember their names off the top of my head, but they were the paranormalists that worked for the Catholic Church, and that's what they did, and that's where Annabelle was found. We talked about this previously, like a Raggedy Ann doll, but it was just really unsettling.
Well, while you look that up, I'll buy you some time because there's another kind of pushed card, Screaming Nemesis, and it's a spirit, but it's red, so it doesn't exactly fit any of your themes. But the art to me really kind of like vibes out to the Stranger Things villain, not Vecna, but like just this weird pulsy red evil thing that's just looming at you, you know?
I think that's cool. And I think things like that again are pretty mainstream. You know, horror is very mainstream nowadays. It's not like the thing that's just in the middle or the back of the video store, like, you know, that's got one rack at Blockbuster that everyone just bypasses because they want to go look and see what the latest Tom Cruise movie is, right? Horror has been a big, for a long time now, right? This isn't something that's new. But I think that things like that they're mass appealing nowadays. And I think people have always, but maybe now more so than ever, they like the horror, they like the shock factor, they like the big shock value, right? So things like that. And Stranger Things is obviously one of the biggest TV phenomena of the last decade, maybe, right? Huge deal. Very, very popular, very successful TV show. So I think if you're playing on something like that, it's a win.
And the husband and wife team that did that during the 70s was the Warrens. I knew we would get there.
Right.
Thank you, Google. But yeah, it was just such a great thing. And they went around doing that, and it kind of made that a little mainstream. They made some movies, and you know, it's a great little series of films, The Conjuring and so on and so forth. But one of my favorite of all time was Stephen King. We talked about this when we talked about Duskmore, and I enjoyed it. Everything about it, Pennywise the Clown. And one of the iterations they made, and I'm like, well, this is another example. It's a human clown. Can I incorporate this in my vampires, werewolves, and zombies and break outside of my mold? And this is directed towards the listeners. And I'm going to ask, are you being so restrictive on your flavor, your theme? And now I'm going to point that question I did towards Stu, who's been hindered on this Doom Cube because you're following what, Doom 64?
No, I'm trying to be very careful in sticking to the monsters, monster types, themes, level graphics, even the items of like the early Dooms in general. So right, all the early mid to late 90s PC Doom iterations, Doom 64, which is an absolute favorite of mine. I don't know, it's on sale occasionally on GOG Games or one of the platforms. I don't know. I don't think it's Steam. I got it. It's like $2.67. You can buy Doom 64 for, and it's brand new title. It's not a remake of any of the PC versions. It's its own unique game. It's got unique monsters. So anything around that era with Doom, I'm trying to be faithful to. And you are absolutely right. It is very, very difficult. And the reason why the cube has stagnated so much, because I am trying to, you know, obviously build archetypes and stuff like that, but I'm also trying to stay true to that theme. So this has got to the point where originally I was thinking, okay, I'll look for imps and I'll look for zombies and I'll look for goblins and I'll look for, you know, spiders, because all of that stuff exists within the Doom universe, to the point where I was like, man, I'm only at like 100 cards, and I've even added a few lands in here, and my first iteration was going to be 180 cards. So it got to the point where I'm literally opening up Scryfall and just going through every single card. I'm not restricting it by a creature type. I'm not restricting it by a super type or anything like that. I'm just saying I want to look at every single red card or every single black card to try and find cards that fit that theme, and it is very difficult.
Well, Tyler, that's what is happening to me. But I already got past that, right? The cube is built. But then I started creating my own barriers, my own walls within the design of my own cube space, right? Going back to, you talked about an otter. It would be fantastic mechanically, but it doesn't fit all my tropes, my genre, my aesthetics. He's trying to build a cube right now for the very first time. And he now is a host on a podcast show talking about cubes all day. So he's got this pressure placed upon him. He better get it right the first time because we're going to be really disappointed in our good friends too. But secondly, he's restricting himself so much to a fault to follow he's going into the video game, but he won't go into the movies that had The Rock in it.
No.
He won't touch it. He won't touch it, even though it opens up a whole new universe.
Absolutely not a chance.
See, that's what I'm talking about. That's kind of the point of this episode, Tyler. And I wanted your thoughts on that.
Please tell me I'm doing the right thing by being faithful to those old Doom classics.
I think you're doing the Lord's work because I literally just played through Doom 1 and 2 for the first time. Went back to it. From when I was a kid, I thought it was like the hardest game ever. And then I realized now that I'm 30, I'm like, oh, I never opened the mini-map. But
now I'm
incredible games.
Yeah, now I'm playing those games, and I usually set myself up to do it maybe once every year or two, and I will try to play through. And I don't not allow myself to reload or anything that crazy, but I try and play through each of the games. That's the original Doom PC games as well as Doom 64, and I try and go through them all without taking any damage on the hardest difficulty until the last fight.
And you, the listener, right now, saying, "Hey, Anthony started talking about a clown," but I did that intentionally. That was a whole setup here. I knew what I was going to get. I was fishing a little bit, but it was tangential for a reason because I wanted to demonstrate this isn't just a me problem. This expands to the listeners, expands to Stu trying to design his first cube. Now let's go back to the balloon man I was talking about.
Jolly
balloon man.
He's a jolly balloon man.
And
so jolly.
Again, the art, the aesthetics. Or for me, they're great. I don't know if you'd asked me this 5 years ago, if this been printed, what I would have argued probably till I was blue in the face. But now I think my curation has grown that I realize a card like this, and I'll read it to you, one colorless and Boros, get legendary creature, human clown. It's a 1/4. Haste, pay 1, tap. Create a token that's a copy of another target creature you control, except it's a 1/1 red balloon creature in addition to its other colors and types, and it has flying and haste. Sacrifice it at the beginning of the next end step, activate only as a sorcery. Which they don't have a token for this because it's too broad. You have to use a copy token, which is pretty wild. Just FYI, you'll find copy tokens for that.
Okay.
But this card plays into the tropes that I'm trying to do, but it goes into that modern horror, which was hard for me because I'm coming out of horror written back in the late 1800s, right? I mean, if you really think about that's where Innistrad was very
inspired by that.
Yeah.
Absolutely it was. Like I say, it was those old school in your face horror tropes, the vampires that are chasing you, the werewolves and zombies and goblins and stuff like that, right? There's nothing subtle about that kind of horror whereby and this just seems to follow on with that to me. Like, I don't even think this is a stretch to add that because the creature types, right? Which I don't want to say that you've got hung up on those creature types because I don't think you have. And I think that you've tried to stay true to the theme in general, but tried to be expansive. But Innistrad, obviously, if you're Innistrad Plus, and that was very like in those lanes of those creature types. But I think just from a vibe of what a horror cube that's very in your face can kind of represent, I think a card like this is just on point.
So Tyler, going back to the monkey, when you eventually solve the monkey image, and
I
listeners
got
as well,
there.
you have to look at both of them. We'll really explain. It was the question I asked myself. If there's vampires, there's werewolves, there's zombies, there's spirits, why can't there be other presence in this world that I've created that are malicious, right? They're not all out there doing good. When you look at the monkey, you'll see what's happening. Find the other art. But things like human clowns and unsettling dolls and all that, nightmares, horrors, because vampires are the thing of nightmares. We've just become desensitized from this idea. We've made tropes about it. We made jokes about it. Look at Fright Night. Unfortunately, the Colin Farrell version of Fright Night. If you think that's the original, watch the original Fright Night. It's so good and so bad at the same time. But that's where those type of ideas where I'm trying to stay in this canon that I'm making, like I'm writing my own canon, but the canon's already written. There's nothing that really restricts me except for me. And you said this, Tyler, you said this like straight up. Why am I withholding the ability to enhance the player experience?
Yeah, and you look at Jolly Balloon Man, and it's like, he doesn't, like, I didn't even put together that it was an It reference, which now makes a lot of sense. But, like, you do think about just weird, like things you say to people, like, oh, be careful meeting up with that person on the internet so they don't make a wind chime out of your skin or something. Like, and this guy's making a balloon out of your face. It's like a little reminiscent and all. But what's more important is that this card, even if someone doesn't recognize that it's a horror movie or recognize that it's scary, this card is really cool because it enables so many cool effects that you could be building and like doing something weird with. Like, I was trying to like think of a way to break it earlier, and I was thinking of one of my favorite horror cards, Mind Slicer. It's an old Odyssey card where you discard both players' hands whenever it dies, and I'm like, oh, you could make a Mind Slicer every turn and make sure they're always on madness. It would be kind of sick.
I love that that's where your brain goes, because that is where my brain goes. I see this pick one, pack one, and all I'm thinking is, right, I have a chance to build a deck that is Boros predominantly. Boros is typically a pretty aggro and hate-beary kind of color combination, right? So now I'm just looking at how can I maximize the effect of this card? And I'm looking for, where are my ETBs? Where are my undeath triggers? Where is all that kind of stuff, right? I'm not just looking for, again, with red, where are my turn hasty creatures sideways with prowess? Or where are my creatures that tax an opponent, right? Along those kind of lines. So this is why, not just from a thematic perspective, even though I still think it fits so great, but just from a fun experience, just what you mentioned earlier, it fits perfectly.
I'm thinking I just want a red balloon, and I just want to know where you guys got your red balloon at.
I've got 99 of them.
Oh, nice. German or English?
German.
Okay, that's
only
the one that matters.
Only German.
So what's so cool about Duskmorn is it broadened my horizons. It was able to, I guess, crack that hard candy shell that I've been kind of fighting against, right? Now I can justify that I can have nightmares and horrors in the canon that I have written for this cube, right? If I can justify having stuff like, at the time, Mystic Confluence or Force of Wills, why can't I have a nightmare? Why can't I have a Hedron Crab? Well, I'm not going to put it, but why can't I have it, right? Why can't I have an otter? Well, I'm not going to do it, but you see what I'm saying? The restriction can sometimes come at the detriment of the cube, and you as the curator, and it's a very personal decision, have to decide like where's that line, right? Where are you willing to go with this? How far do you want to take it? Because I think this cube projects the vibes that I want it to project, and I don't want to, that's like a social contract that I've made with both myself and my players that I don't want to violate by putting cutesy things in there unless it's disturbingly cute. Give me a dead otter, Wizards. That's what I'm asking for. But Tyler.
I'm glad you did get there, though, because there's a meaty, juicy MTG core that you've cracked through now that you've gotten through that shell. And I got to say, I think it was kind of a miss for how few actual horrors were in your horror cube. It was a little surprising to me.
There you go. There's the next iteration. Add some actual horrors in there. That's an interesting point. I don't know if that's...
Toxrill's not going in there.
Toxrill's not going in there. No.
Toxrill would be a sweet reanimator target.
We'll talk about Toxrill after we finish up here. I'll talk to you about Toxrill because I gotta love him. I got love in my heart for Toxrill.
But we just want to go ahead and say thank you for our champion joining us on this. Just a little bit of dissecting of the cube and talk about some horror tropes with us.
Gonna try and go back to back at UberCubeathon 2025. It's gonna happen. Listen here. Watch this space. We'll be announcing something hopefully early in the new year and get something going.
We're going to play a little bit of Queen when you come into the building. We are the champions. We know what to do. We got a whole soundtrack.
I was thinking the Rocky music. Just keep it real simple.
Keep it simple.
You know, put the cloak on and the crown, hold the staff.
Yeah. Tyler, it's been a real pleasure.
Thanks for having me, you guys. This was a lot of fun.
Cool. Thank you for coming on and hanging out. It's been awesome.
All right, so I hope everybody got a little bit of something out of this. It's spooky season, as we said. We've got some more coming down the pipe here. We got some more spooky content coming your way in the month of October. And if you're traveling to CubeCon, you're listening to this, we will see you there. Other than that, could you take us to the socials, please?
I will. As always, I'm going to start with our Patreons. So Chris Fitzgerald, Timber Dragon, Brian Christensen, Keaton Schultz, Lord Justice, Chris Singer, Nick LaPointe, Preston, and Sam McKenna. Big thank you to all of you guys for the ongoing support and helping us keep the lights on here at UberCube. If you want to get in on the conversation, as well as our wonderful Discord, you can check out the MTG Facebook drafting page at facebook.com/groups/MTGCube. Come check out the conversation where our very own Anthony Adams is an administrator over there, and you know what that does to a man. If you love the show, we would truly appreciate, give us a 5-star review on your chosen podcast platform. Really goes a long way. Get us out there to the big community. And you can also support the show by using our altersleeves.com/UberCube affiliate link to get 5% off your purchase, or inkedgaming.com/UberCube for all kinds of cool custom products and large volume products for your Magic experience. You can find us at Twitter. We are at UberCubeMTGPod, or you can reach us via email if you got a question about the episode or about Cube in general. You can reach us at UberCubeMTGPodcast@gmail.com. Again, big thanks to all of our patrons, and if you want to get in on the action and help support the show, go to patreon.com/UberCube, and we're still trying to figure out some addition and some bonuses for the patrons, but we'll figure something out, I'm sure.
So other than that, we're going to say the thing that we always say here at UberCube is Happy Cubing.